He bought the ghost town for $100. Just wanted quiet, maybe something to fix. But behind a cracked window he saw a girl coughing in the cold, and an old woman who wouldn't ask for help. What he found wasn't silence. It was a fight no one else stayed long enough to see. And in the Old West, sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is not ride away. If these old Western stories feel like a fire worth keeping, share the warmth, leave a like, and subscribe so the trail never runs cold. Part 1. The Shadow Behind the Broken Window. The wind in that part of the valley didn't sing much. It dragged, slow and low, like it remembered sorrow. Silas Boone rode into Dry Creek just before sundown. The sky the color of singed cotton, and the dirt beneath his boots powdered like old bones. His mare, Rosie, had gone quiet 5 miles back, the way animals do when they know you're walking into something left unfinished. Dry Creek wasn't much. 2 rows of buildings, most with their faces sagged like tired men. A leaning church without a bell, a saloon whose front sign had lost half its name. The last K in blackjack hung on a single nail, spinning when the wind pushed hard enough. He'd bought the place from the county clerk in 3 stones, $100 flat. No back taxes, no interest, just the rights to a dying place and the silence that came with it. Folks called it a ghost town. But Silas didn't believe in ghosts, not the kind that walked, just the kind that followed. He tied Rosie to the old water trough in front of what used to be the mercantile. The wood was dry rot along the edges, but the trough still held the shape of usefulness, even if the bottom was cracked. That was how most things in this world were, he figured, still holding shape even when they'd long since been emptied out. He climbed the steps slowly. The porch groaned beneath his boots, a complaint from years of neglect. But it held. Then he saw it, barely but sure. A flicker. Behind the dusty glass of the second window, up in what used to be the proprietor's quarters, something moved. Not a curtain, not a breeze, a shape. Small, human, still. He didn't draw iron, didn't call out. He just stood there, watching. The air had shifted, warmer than before, touched with something not quite smoke and not quite stew. A memory of wood fire and old potatoes, the kind of smell that meant someone still fought to stay alive. Silas stepped back, checked the angle of the sun, and turned toward the livery. Behind him, the cracked windows stilled, but the shape hadn't gone. The next morning, before the sun cracked over the ridge, Silas boiled coffee in a rusted percolator he found behind the bar of the old saloon. He'd cleaned the place enough to sit without getting tetanus, though the air still smelled of mildew and mice. He poured 2 cups, set one on the table across from him. Let it steam, didn't say a word. Back in Wyoming, before the fire, before the barn caved in, before his brother screamed and then didn't, Silas used to make coffee for 2, 1 cup for himself, 1 for the man who taught him how to mend a fence without wasting a single nail. Now he did it out of habit, maybe hope. Outside, the wind blew light, carrying dry seed and the hiss of something trying to grow. Across the way, smoke curled thin from the mercantile chimney, not thick enough for cooking, but steady enough to say, "I'm here." By noon, he'd walked the perimeter of the town. It wasn't much, but it was his now. That's what the paper said. 14 structures still standing, more or less. An old schoolhouse without desks. A blacksmith's barn missing a wall. A jail cell with no bars left on the window. The church had a Bible still inside, though the cover was warped and the pages stuck together. He didn't open it. Didn't seem right just yet. The general store. He hadn't stepped inside. Not fully. He'd knocked once, not loud, just enough to show respect. No answer, no movement, just the scent of smoke and maybe something bitter on the air. Root tea, maybe, or sickness. He didn't push. Instead, he left a sack of flour and a tin of beans near the door, not because he owed anything, just because a man who's seen death up close learns to recognize life when it's barely holding on. That evening, as the sun bled dry across the hills, Silas sat on the porch of the saloon, watching the wind carry dust in long, tired streaks, and across the road, behind that same cracked window, the shape appeared again. Still small, still unmoving, but this time a hand rose, barely, not a wave, not a plea, just a presence. He lifted his tin cup slightly in response, the way a man might greet an old friend without needing to speak. Then he set it down, let it cool. Inside the mercantile, the chimney exhaled once more. That night he didn't lock the saloon door. Didn't seem necessary. It wasn't that Silas had been looking for people. Truth was, he bought Dry Creek for the silence, for space, for a kind of ending that didn't need to be loud. After Wyoming, after burying too many things he couldn't carry, he wanted a place where he could disappear without falling. But Dry Creek, it turned out, hadn't died all the way. It had just gone quiet, like him. And now it waited. So he waited, too. Part 2, The Firekeeper and the Ledger. No one read. The first voice he heard in Dry Creek wasn't loud. It didn't shout or welcome. It didn't even rise much above the crackle of her fire. "Don't come any closer," said the woman inside the mercantile. "Not unless you want a hole in your chest." Silas stopped halfway up the steps. The porch beneath him sagged in the middle, but it still held. He raised both hands. "Easy. I ain't a threat," he said, "and you already knew that." The shotgun barrel didn't waver, just narrowed its aim from the dark behind a slatted curtain, but Silas heard the shift in her breath. Caution, not panic. Practice. "I own this place now," he added quietly. A pause. "The town?" He nodded, then remembered she couldn't see it. "Yes, ma'am, bought it from the county, paperwork and all." Another long pause. Then the curtain moved, just enough to reveal part of her. One pale cheek, an eye lined deep like bark in dry summer, and a sliver of gray hair twisted back under a kerchief. She didn't lower the gun, but the tightness in her jaw softened. "They sold it. Whole damn town. $100. She almost laughed, but it came out bitter. "They tried selling me off for less." Silas said nothing to that. He just stood there with his hands still raised, waiting for the wind to shift. When it did, it carried out the smell of burning cedar and sickness, the kind that clung to quilts and the edge of a woman's sleeve. "Name's Clara May," she said finally. "I ain't squatters, I ain't criminals. I'm just trying to make it through one more winter without getting pushed off." Silas slowly lowered his arms. Then we're of the same mind. He turned, stepped off the porch, and left a bundle wrapped in oilskin on the stoop. Dried beans, a tin of coffee, his last clean shirt. No words followed, no thanks came. Just the sound of the door creaking open after he'd gone. That night, as cold settled in and the saloon's old stove began to moan from the heat, Silas stared at the second coffee cup again. The habit had become almost sacred. Pour 2, drink 1. The other, left untouched, steam rising to no one. Except this time, before he finished his first sip, someone knocked at the door. Not a strong knock, just enough to rattle the loose slat where the glass used to be. Silas opened it slowly. Outside stood Clara May, still holding the shotgun, but not aiming it. At her feet, wrapped in a thin patchwork blanket, sat a little girl, pale, thin, breathing shallow like a whisper, too tired to be spoken. Clara nodded once. "She's sick, got lungs like paper, but we can't move again, mister. She won't survive another wagon ride." Silas stepped back, holding the door. Inside, the girl didn't look up, just leaned into her grandmother's leg, like the world behind her had stopped being safe long ago. Clara helped the child settle near the stove. Silas passed her a folded tarp for padding, and the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was thick with the kind of respect two battered souls give each other. He made no promise, offered no solution. But he brought over the second cup of coffee untouched and set it down in front of Clara. "It's cold now," he said. She took it anyway. Clara didn't talk much that night, but she did unfold a piece of paper from her coat. Old, creased corners rubbed thin from time and handling. "This," she said, smoothing it flat on the table, "is what started it. My husband, bless his heart, couldn't read, and trusted the man who said this meant temporary lien. Turned out to be a debt note signed under his name. A fake one." She tapped the bottom with one cracked fingernail. "Look at that seal. Banker's stamp. County registered. Ain't a soul ever looked at it long enough to see it's been forged." Silas studied it, the curve of the R in register, the tilt of the Y in county. Familiar, too familiar. He got up, fetched his own deed to Dry Creek, and laid it beside hers. The seals matched. The ink shimmered the same under lamplight. But the signatures, one was sharp, the other slow and shaky, like someone trying to copy what they didn't understand. "Who did this?" he asked, voice low. She looked up, eyes the color of dusk. "Don't know, but they've done it to more than just us. Maybe folks too tired to fight. Maybe folks too proud to admit they were tricked." Silas didn't say much more, just sat back, nodding to himself like a man who'd walked these shadows before. Because he had. Because he remembered the day his father came in from the fence line, holding a paper like that, his hands trembling too much to button his coat. Later that night, when Clara had gone back across the street and the girl was tucked beneath borrowed quilts, Silas sat at the saloon window, watching the last of the smoke curl from the mercantile's chimney. He felt the ache in his bones again, not the cold kind, but the memory kind. Some towns die from drought, others die from silence, but this one still breathed, just barely, and maybe that was enough to start with. Part 3, a stoop rebuilt, a thin stew shared, and nothing said. Morning in Dry Creek came with no rooster, no whistle, no church bell, just the soft hush of wind through old shingles and the slow creak of leather as Silas Boone stood on the porch of the saloon with a mug in one hand and a hammer in the other. The step beneath him had finally given way. Dry rot had eaten through the wood long ago, like time eats through memory, slow, steady, cruel. He knelt, felt the grain with his fingers, and measured the crack without a ruler. Some men built with levels. Silas built with feel. He spent the better part of the morning scavenging through the old livery, digging out planks untouched by termites and rusted nails that still held straight. No one asked what he was doing. No one needed to. Across the dirt path, the mercantile door remained shut, but the chimney smoked again, the kind of smoke that rises thin and fast when there's not enough wood to go around. By midday, the stoop was back in place, not pretty, but it held. He left a bucket of water on their step, clean, full, cold, didn't knock, didn't wait. The sun sagged low behind the hills, casting shadows long enough to trip a tired man, when Silas heard it, the soft scrape of metal on wood. He opened the saloon, door to find a bowl sitting on the stoop. Tin, dented, steam barely rising. Inside it, thin stew, mostly broth, a few floating bits of potato, maybe onion. No note, no spoon, just warmth. He stood there a long while. Then he bent down, picked it up, and took it inside. He didn't eat right away, just stared at it for a time, the way you do when something small reminds you that you're still seen. He sat at the long table where card games once ruined men and set the bowl down next to the empty second coffee cup. That second cup hadn't moved in years. He poured half his share of stew into a second bowl, placed it across from his own. Didn't speak to it, didn't have to. Later, as night laid its heavy hand across the valley, and coyotes started calling to one another with questions no man could answer, he heard the cough again. It came from across the street, sharp, dry, rhythmic, a child's cough, one that didn't improve with time. He stoked the stove, not because he was cold, but because he hated hearing that sound while sitting warm. Then he stepped out into the dark with a small sack of split pine and left it by the mercantile's wall, under the window where he'd first seen the curtain shift. Still he said nothing, just left it there and walked back across the dust. In the morning the sack was gone, and beside the bucket he'd left the day before there was something else, an apple. Bruised, soft in one corner, but red as hope. Wrapped around its stem, a scrap of fabric, torn calico, probably from the girl's dress. He turned it over in his hand and felt something he hadn't felt in a long while. Not joy, not even warmth, just the slight, stubborn presence of being included. That afternoon, Silas took a walk, no destination, just wandered past the boarded church, the leaning hotel, the old jail where a drunk once tried to hang himself with a belt made of rawhide. He stopped in front of the schoolhouse, still standing despite cracked beams and busted windows. Dust lay thick across the desks. An old slate board bore faint words written in chalk that had long since faded. Then he heard her voice again. Clara's. Not close, not calling, just speaking low and steady. He turned the corner and saw her kneeling in the dead garden behind the mercantile, scraping at the earth with a rusted spoon. No plants yet, just dry furrows. Still she worked them like they might bloom tomorrow. He didn't disturb her, just watched her fight for life where none should grow. That night, after stew and firelight, after the cough had faded into restless sleep, Clara opened the door. She didn't step out, just leaned on the frame, holding her arms tight across her ribs. "Why'd you stay?" she asked, not looking at him. Silas didn't answer right away. He stirred the coals with a poker, careful not to let them flare. "When a man's lost everything," he said slowly, "there ain't much left to run from. Just places ain't tried yet." She nodded, barely, then added, "Ain't much left to defend either." Silas looked up. Their eyes met, wary but not closed. "I reckon that's where you're wrong," he said. Then he tipped his hat, stood, and closed the saloon door for the night. The wind blew harder that evening, cold and biting, but neither stove went out, and in the morning both chimneys smoked again. In Dry Creek, that was enough. Enough to say, we're still here. And maybe, just maybe, that meant something worth staying for. Part 4. Old Papers and the Memory of Being Forced Off Land. It rained one morning in Dry Creek, not much. Just enough to settle the dust and stir old smells from the wood. That kind of rain didn't soak through, but it had a way of bringing back things you'd rather stayed buried. Silas Boone sat at the table inside the saloon, his coffee cooling beside the second cup he still poured out of habit. On the table, 2 pieces of paper lay side by side. One was brittle from age, his father's deed, passed down through too many hands and too few good years. The other was Clara's, folded so many times the creases had gone soft. Its seal was stamped thick but not embossed, and the signature at the bottom looked like it had been scrawled by a clerk in a hurry. He didn't know why he took them both out that day. Maybe because the air smelled of his mother's dress after a storm. Maybe because Clara hadn't spoken since the night she leaned on her doorframe and asked him why he stayed. Or maybe because Ellie's cough had gone quiet, and he wasn't sure that was good news. He traced the edges of both papers with a calloused thumb. They looked different, not just in ink, but in weight, in intent. His father's deed had come from the state office. He remembered the day the courier arrived, how his old man washed his hands before touching it. "This here's what makes you rightful," he'd said, voice caught between pride and apology. "Ain't land if you don't hold paper." But they'd lost that land all the same. Silas had been 12, too small to fight, too angry to cry. A man with shiny boots and a badge had come, waving something just like Clara's page, same seal, same tone, same cold authority. His mother had held that paper like it was a death warrant, the ink bleeding in the rain as she dropped to her knees. The house had still smelled like bread when they boarded it up. That was the first time he'd thought the law might not mean justice. Now, all these years later, holding Clara's debt transfer beside his deed to Dry Creek, he saw the lie. The seals matched, but the signatures didn't. His bore a name printed with care. Hers, well, someone had written X for a man who could sign his name. And under it, another hand had added a signature that curved too neatly to be real. He stared at it a long while, letting the truth settle the way ash does. Soft, final. This wasn't about debt. Not really. It was about erasure. About a town emptied one family at a time, paper by paper, until only silence remained. He stood up, walked across the saloon, and pulled the ledger from behind the old bar. He opened it and flipped past blank entries and faded notes from better years. Found a fresh page, laid both documents on the bar, and copied every word of Clara's paper into the book. Then he folded the paper gently, tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat, and walked across the street. Clara was kneeling again in the dirt, planting seeds that probably wouldn't take. She didn't look up when he approached. He knelt beside her, slowly, laid the folded deed between them. Her hands stilled. She stared at it, but didn't touch. "Yours is forged," he said low. "Same seal, different man's name, not your husband's." She nodded once, just once. "I reckon they wanted this place cleared out," he added. "Folks like you, no one'd ask." Another pause. Then she murmured, "They don't ask." They never did. The way she said it, it wasn't bitter, just tired, like someone who'd spent too long being expected to leave and too long trying not to. He stayed beside her as she worked a few more rows in silence. The dirt crumbled between their fingers, dry and stubborn. Then she said, almost to herself, "He couldn't read." But he trusted them, thought a stamp meant something. Silas nodded. "So did my father." They didn't speak again for a while, just planted, just breathed, just existed together beneath a sky that didn't care who owed what. When he left, she didn't thank him. And he didn't need her to. But that evening, as twilight turned the mercantile's windows to pale gold, a cloth bundle appeared on his step. Inside, a small tin of dried herbs, a cracked book of psalms, and a hand-stitched kerchief folded over 3 words, "For your ledger." He unfolded it slowly, let the words sit with him like old company. Then he placed the kerchief inside the bar's ledger, under Clara's copied deed, closed the book, poured the second cup of coffee, and this time, for the first time, he reached for it. Part 5. Boots, Badges, and the Law That Came Knocking. The sound came just after dawn, boots, 6 of them, crunching gravel. Silas Boone stood on the porch of the old saloon with his coat unbuttoned, coffee warm in his hand. The wind carried the smell of juniper and the copper sting of saddle leather. Not many rode into Dry Creek anymore, and none with spurs that clinked like coins on wood. Then came the voice, low, official, and carved from old oak. "Boone." He didn't answer, just turned his head, and watched 3 men ride up. The sheriff came first, Jed Crowley, long face, gray mustache, badge dull with dust. 2 deputies flanked him, younger, tighter in the shoulders, wearing the look of men who believed orders meant truth. They dismounted, slow, not angry, not friendly, just sure. Crowley stepped up to the porch, nodded once. "Got a paper says you're harboring trespassers," he said. Silas didn't blink. "I bought this town, Sheriff, every board of it." Crowley lifted a folded document from his coat. "Not you I'm here for. Woman in the mercantiles sitting on debt she don't own. Papers legal, stamped. Town sale don't erase it." "Debt's fake," Silas said, voice quiet, final. Crowley gave a long, even look. "Fake or not, I'm the law in 3 counties. That girl in there's sick, real sick. If she dies on your watch, blood's on you." Silas set the coffee down on the porch rail, didn't raise his voice, didn't move fast. "She dies out there," he said. "Then it's on all of us." Crowley shifted, jaw hardening. Silas saw the moment in his eyes, that line between duty and doubt, where some men dig in and others remember their fathers. He stepped off the porch, boots heavy on the steps, stopped between the sheriff and the store. "She ain't leavin'." Clara was already on the mercantile stoop, holding a rusted double barrel. Her hands trembled, but the barrels did not. Behind her, the door hung open, and inside, a little girl lay still on a cot, too thin for dreaming. The silence in Dry Creek then was unlike any before. No wind, no birds, just the sound of a sick child breathing ragged through dust. Crowley stepped forward, slow, palms visible. "You draw a line, Boone?" Silas didn't answer, didn't need to. His boots were already there, planted like fence posts on the dry earth. His eyes never left the sheriff's, not in defiance, not in anger. Just stillness, a man too tired to move again, a man who'd already lost enough. The deputies looked to Crowley, waiting. The sheriff studied Silas, then Clara, then the house behind her. He folded the paper back up. "Reckon I'll ride out," he said. "For now." They mounted and rode off without another word, but the dust they left behind took longer to settle, and Clara's knees buckled the moment they were gone. Silas caught her, held her upright like he'd once held fence rails after a storm, splintered and soaked through but still needed. That night, the wind came back, brought with it the first cold bite of winter. Silas built the fire higher. Clara stayed inside the mercantile, didn't speak, didn't sleep, just sat with Ellie, who now coughed blood into cloth, whispering things no child should have to say about angels and bread and the sound of snow falling. Outside, Silas paced the porch like a sentinel without orders, and when the dawn finally bled across the hills, his boots were still planted right where the law had stood. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew this. If they came again, with paper or pistols, they'd have to reckon with something not written in ink. A man who'd lost too much to walk away, and a woman who'd stopped asking for permission to stay. Part 6, The Man Who Upheld Law and the One Who Remembered Mercy. The sheriff didn't ride far that morning. He stopped half a mile out, beneath a split cedar ridge where the wind had carved stone into faces. There Jed Crowley, unsaddled, fed his horse oats from his palm and sat under the lip of rock with a flask he never touched when working. He didn't drink it now either, just held it like a man needing something solid. Behind him, Dry Creek still smoldered from the silence he left behind. He was born in a town like that, flat, quiet, with a church that leaned in the wind and a schoolhouse no one cleaned. His mother once gave a pie to a family sleeping in the livery. Sheriff back then made her feel shame for it. Jed never forgot the look on her face when he was 12. Pie dish empty in her lap. The word charity spit at her like a sin. Now here he was, 47 and standing in boots stamped with the same badge, acting like law and mercy couldn't share the same breath. He wiped the dust from the corner of his mouth and said aloud, to nobody, "Hell, Jed, you became the thing you hated." That afternoon, Crowley returned, but not with paper, not with backup. He came alone, without his deputies, his coat unbuttoned, the tin badge dull in his pocket instead of his chest. Silas saw him ride up and step down off the porch without speaking. Clara watched from behind the curtain, her hands locked tight around a Bible she hadn't opened in years. The sheriff didn't go for the mercantile this time. He stopped at the well, tied his horse, and sat on a stump where children used to gather during candy days, back when Dry Creek had sugar and smiles. He waited. Silas came to him with nothing but stillness in his stride. Crowley looked up. "Boone," he said, "I was wrong." The two men sat there side by side, with space between them like a fence neither wanted to cross too fast. "She's worse?" Crowley asked. Silas nodded. "Girl barely knows when the sun's up. Clara's near gone herself, worrying."
Jed reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, not a warrant this time, a letter, handwritten, old. "My niece," he said, "had the same cough 3 winters ago. Doctor gave up on her. Navajo man out near Cholla Springs
Brought her back with smoke and roots. Don't ask me how." He placed the letter between them. "You trust him?" Silas asked. "Man saved my kin," Crowley said. "I owe more than just the law." Clara stepped forward. She hadn't said a word since the sheriff returned. Now she stood barefoot on the porch, gray hair frayed, voice dry as winter wind. "You think he'd help a girl ain't from his people?" she asked. Crowley met her eyes. "He don't see tribes, only breath." Clara looked toward the room where Ellie lay, a child who coughed in gasps, dreams twisted in fever. Then she did something no one expected. She stepped down from the porch, walked past both men, and touched the sheriff's hand. "Software just once. Then let's ride," she said. They packed at sundown. Silas saddled his mare and laid Ellie in a blanket across his arms. Crowley led. No words, no farewell. Only the sound of wind rustling in dead cottonwoods, and a town quiet as prayer. Dry Creek held its breath, hoping, daring, waiting. And as they rode into the coming night, 3 figures, 1 child, and 1,000 shadows behind them, Clara leaned down and whispered in Ellie's ear, "Hold on, baby, the wind's changing." Part 7. The Faces. History tried to erase. The next morning, Ruth Ann Baylor came riding down the trail alone, but not for long. She led 5 others, 2 men, 2 women, 1 boy, not yet 16, all lean from hunger and harder miles. Their boots were worn through. 1 man limped from a split heel. The boy held a hammer too heavy for his age, but gripped it like something sacred. They didn't ask permission. They rode in like folks who used to belong, and maybe still did. Ruth had been a nurse once, in Colorado Springs before they sold the hospital land out from under her, and told her to go west like the rest. Her husband, Jacob, was a schoolteacher. He died the winter after they were evicted. Pneumonia settling in lungs made weak from sleeping under canvas. She buried him behind a burned-out barn with no marker, but she carried his ledger, not the kind for banks. His was for memory, and in that ledger were names, places, dates, 23 families, all forced off land with matching debt notices, same misspellings, same smudged signatures, same embossed seals. The bank hadn't just taken homes, it had erased the record of those who lived in them. Silas Boone returned to Dry Creek that afternoon, saddle sore and bone-tired, Ellie breathing easier beside Clara under a thick wool blanket. The firelight in the mercantile looked steadier now. He smelled beans cooking, felt something like warmth come back to the porch steps he'd propped up days before. And then he saw Ruth. Her hat still bore a tear stitched up with red thread, and her hands were stained with ink. But her voice? It was clear. "I came," she said, "'cause no one else would write it down. But someone has to." They spread Jacob's ledger across a dry barrel turned sideways, inked their names next to the stories inside. One woman, Tilda Brooks, had been 9 months pregnant when they forced her from Lariat Bend, lost the baby 2 nights later. The boy, Jasper, hadn't spoken since, but when Ruth touched his shoulder and nodded toward the ledger, he scribbled the word Papa in the corner. That was enough. They turned the old church into a hall for records, tore out rotted pews, laid boards smooth with calloused hands, and lit candles for the ones who didn't make it. Each name written down was a fence rebuilt. One more piece of ground claimed not by force, but by memory. That night, as the fire cracked and beans simmered low, Silas sat on the porch with a tin cup gone cold. "You reckon there's justice in it?" he asked Ruth, not looking up. She sipped slowly, answered slower. "There's no justice in silence, only forgetting." He nodded, then poured her another. "Oh." No one said much else, but by morning Ruth was repairing the blackboard in the schoolhouse. Tilda tended the fire. Jasper planted beans behind the mercantile, marking the rows with smooth stones. And in Dry Creek, a place the county once called defunct, you could hear something strange. Laughter, small, cracked, but real. Part 8, the record book of a banker's shame. It was Ruth who brought up the name. Quietly, just after the fire had dimmed, and Clara began humming some old song with no words. "Enoch Sloan," she said, "bank clerk out of Mesilla. He's the one who copied 'em." Silas raised his head. "He copied what?" "The forgeries, every last one. Said he wanted proof before the devil came callin'. Then he vanished." She pulled a handbill from her bag, creased, weathered, corner burned. A missing persons poster. No reward. No follow-up. Just a name someone wanted. Forgotten. Next morning, Silas saddled the old roan and packed 2 canteens. Ruth met him near the edge of town with a rifle slung across her shoulder and a notebook tied to her saddle horn with rawhide cord. "I'm comin' with," she said. He didn't argue. They rode out at first light toward Joshua Ridge, where rumor said Sloan had gone into the Red Rock Canyons and simply never came back. Dust kicked up behind them in slow spirals, the sun like a dull eye watching from above. Crows wheeled in the distance. Somewhere a hawk cried once, and then went silent. No. Midway through the Arroyo Pass, Ruth finally spoke. "I ain't against the law," she said. "I'm against its silence." Silas said nothing, not out of disagreement, but because he'd felt the same way for 30 years and never had words for it. Near sundown they found a trail cut into the stone, narrow as a mule's back. At its end stood a shack, barely more than brush and scrap wood hammered together, half blended into the hillside. There was smoke curling from a stovepipe fashioned out of 2 rusted rifle barrels. And inside sat a man hunched over a table, pen still in hand, writing in a book so worn the leather cover had cracked at every seam. Enoch Sloan looked up, blinked. He hadn't shaved in years. His cheeks were sunken, eyes rimmed red, hands yellowed at the nails from tobacco and ink. "I knew someone had come," he said. "I just didn't think it'd take this long." Ruth stepped forward, voice calm. "You kept them." He nodded, reached under the bench, and pulled out a thick book bound in hide and buckled shut, with a strap that had once been part of a horse's bridle. Inside were page after page of copied loan, documents, signatures forged in the same slanted hand, seals smudged in identical fashion, whole families undone by a pen and a silence that cost nothing to keep. Sloane's voice broke. I was told to destroy it when the bank changed hands, but I couldn't. I knew someday someone might need the truth. Silas took the book in both hands. It was heavier than any rifle he'd ever held, not because of weight, because of what it meant. They camped beneath the stars, far from the wind. Sloane didn't eat much. Just stared into the fire, murmuring numbers like prayers. Ruth sat beside Silas, cross-legged, hands inked with dust and ledger smudge. "He's the kind who don't sleep easy," she said. "None of us do," Silas replied. "Yeah, but at least he's still trying." They rode back 2 days later, through cold wind and morning frost, the ledger tied down tight in a satchel made from stitched denim and prayer. When they crested the ridge above Dry Creek, Ruth reached out and steadied her hat against the gust. Eyes narrowed toward town. She said one thing before they descended. "Let's see if a little truth can outlive a big lie." And Silas Boone, a man who had once buried his brother and thought he'd buried his voice too, whispered back, "It's time." Part 9. Crowley returns, but not to collect. They hadn't been back an hour when Ruth noticed the dust on the horizon. Not wind dust, horse dust. Silas squinted past the water tower and counted 3 riders. No more. The lead wore a badge. Sheriff Jed Crowley rode in slow, not like a man on duty, but like one with too much to say and no clue how to begin. He dismounted at the old well. Didn't touch his gun, didn't raise his voice. Just looked around at the town that shouldn't have been standing. Clara stood in the doorway of the mercantile. Ruth stepped up beside her, arms folded, rifle leaning quiet against the frame. Then the girl coughed, hard. A sound like dry pine splitting in winter. Crowley turned. He didn't flinch. He took off his hat. "So, I came back. Not for orders," he said. "Then for what?" Clara's voice cracked. Crowley looked at Ellie. Thin arms, cheeks pale, eyes dulled from fever. "I knew a man once," he said slow. "Navajo. Saved my niece when the doc gave up. Man's a medicine keeper. Not a showman, not a fraud. Lives past skeleton wash." Silas stepped forward. "And why would he help her?" Crowley didn't answer at first. Just looked down at his hands. Weathered, stained. Like all men who've carried things they never set down. Then, softer than before, "Because I'll ask him." The town didn't speak, didn't argue, but when Clara walked inside, wrapped Ellie in a threadbare shawl and stepped back out, no one stopped her. She nodded once. Crowley nodded back. And for the first time they stood on the same side of something. By nightfall they were 4, Silas, Crowley, Clara, and Ellie, bundled in the back of a wagon lined with old quilts and lantern light. The road was narrow, the wind sharp. No one spoke for miles, until they crossed the flat stretch between Dead Juniper Pass and Coyote's Bend. Then Crowley broke. "My father," he began, "wore this badge, and before him my grandfather. Town called Harpersfield. Gone now." He tightened the reins, jaw stiff. "Your mother," he said to Silas, "she tried to fight 'em, had her deed, had proof. My old man, he ran her off anyhow." Silas didn't speak, just watched the stars shift above the canvas sky. Crowley's voice cracked. He said, "One less squatter, one more lesson. I was 16. I didn't stop him." He turned slightly. Not enough for full shame, but more than pride could handle. "I've been wearing that lesson like skin ever since." They reached Skeleton Wash before midnight. The land rose strange there, twisted mesquite, deep black soil, and wind that didn't whistle so much as hum. Ellie whimpered in her sleep. Clara held her tight. Then from beyond the ridge, a lantern moved slow, steady, deliberate. A man appeared. No horse, just bare feet, and a staff carved with shapes older than the town itself. He said nothing. Not a word, just looked at Ellie, then at Crowley, then pointed one long finger toward the mesa trail. Crowley whispered, "His name's Tomas White Elk. Doesn't speak English, doesn't need to." The wagon turned. No one looked back. Not at the desert, not at the past, not even at the badge Crowley had hung on the wagon hook like a man letting go of something heavy. They didn't ride like lawmen. They didn't ride like fugitives. They rode like kin, bound not by blood, but by the one thing men forget too often, the need to stay, when staying is hardest. Part 10. A night ride through dust and reckoning. The trail narrowed just past the wash. Moonlight caught on frost that clung to the shale, silvering the ground like old coins no one claimed. The wheels creaked in rhythm. 4 beats, 1 groan, then silence again. Ellie didn't cry. She just breathed shallow in Clara's arms, head pressed close to the older woman's chest. Tomas White Elk walked ahead, barefoot, his staff tapping stone like a heartbeat. He hadn't said a word. Didn't need to. Every time he turned and squinted into the cold, his eyes told them what the land would not. Up ahead, the wind was different. They were getting close. Silas rode beside the wagon, reins loose, boots resting lightly in the stirrups. He hadn't spoken since the ridge. Didn't plan to. What lived in his chest now had no name and no business being said aloud. But Crowley did speak, low, like a man digging his own grave with the tip of a spoon. "My brother died before I could make it right." Silas didn't look at him, just kept riding. Name was Garrett, born wrong in the lungs. Sickly, Pa said it. Was God's punishment for Ma, speaking up too much. Never let her forget it. The horse's breath smoked under the stars. Crowley went on, voice cracking. Garrett loved to carve things. Little horses. Pinned one to the post before they took our land. Pa stumped it 'fore we left. Said we needed to forget. Silas shifted in the saddle. Did you? Crowley shook his head. Number why carry that broken horse like a thorn in my boot. They climbed into a narrow canyon then, walls rising black and jagged like someone had split the world open long ago and left it to scar over. Tomas led them to a hollow in the cliff face. Not a house, not even a hut, but a shelter made of stone and cedar, woven through with root and sage. Smoke curled from its low chimney, blue and bitter. He raised his hand, motioned. Silas stopped the wagon. Inside, it was warm. Not from fire, but from the way the air didn't run away. Tomas took Ellie without a word, laid her on a bed of pelts, wrapped her feet in willow leaves soaked in warm ash. Then he sat beside her, eyes closed, lips moving soundless. Clara tried to stand, fell to her knees. Silas reached her, caught her elbow. I should have known earlier, she whispered. No, he said. You should have never had to. Crowley stood in the doorway, didn't go in, didn't go far, just leaned against the frame like a man caught between who he was and who he might be if he ever got brave enough. Silas walked over, quiet. Why'd you bring us here, Jed? Crowley didn't answer right away. Then he looked up, and his voice was hoarse. Because if she dies, I ain't got a reason to wear that badge no more. And maybe I ain't had one for a long time. He pulled something from his coat, a folded ribbon, old, creased, a woman's hair tie. Belonged to my niece, he said. The one Thomas saved. She wore it the day she could finally run again. He handed it to Silas. If he saves this girl, you give it to her. Tell her it came from a man who used to follow rules. Until he remembered mercy. The wind outside picked up. Tomas poured something thick and black into a cup made of polished bone. Steam rose. He placed it to Ellie's lips, tipped it slow. She coughed once, deep and long, and then her chest settled. Not better, but different, like a flame refusing to go out. They stayed through the night. Clara sang a lullaby she didn't remember knowing. Silas stoked the fire when it started to die. Crowley stood guard outside with his coat pulled tight, hands bare. Tomas didn't sleep, didn't eat. He just stayed, the way some men do when they've seen too much to walk away. And sometime near dawn, before the coyotes began to yip, before the sun even threatened the east, Ellie's hand found Clara's. She didn't speak, didn't smile, just held on, as if to say, "I ain't gone yet." And that was enough. Part 11. In a house of earth, roots, and remedy. The fourth night was colder than the rest. Even the canyon walls seemed to flinch from the frost, their breath held tight in the stillness. The stars above hung like they were listening. No coyotes, no owls, no wind, just the crackle of a fire deep inside the earth. Tomas, White Elk, didn't move from his place beside the girl. He crouched there, knees folded beneath him, brow damp with smoke and patience. He stirred roots into a thick, dark tea, yucca, bitter gourd, and something Clara didn't recognize but smelled like blood and sagebrush. He fanned smoke over Ellie's chest, slow and rhythmic, using a woven fan made from crow feathers and old willow bark. When her cough came, it was deeper now, less dry, more anchored, each breath like a rope pulling her back to the world. Clara sat nearby, eyes hollow but wide awake. She held a bundle of threadbare cloth in her lap, an old dress Ellie had once tried to outgrow. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from the memory of waiting too many times for someone not to come back. She began to hum. Then, softly, her voice broke through. A tune, old as the hills, lullaby from her own mother's mouth. I ride the wind, I walk the dust, my child sleeps where the earth is just... The words cracked like ice breaking, but she kept going. Not because Ellie could hear, maybe she could, maybe not, but because something in Clara needed to remember that songs could still be sung in this world, that not all was gone yet. Crowley hadn't said a word since the night before. He stood outside the shelter, hat off, boots planted. At one point Silas brought him a tin cup of hot water. No coffee, just boiled well water with a touch of honey root. Crowley didn't say thanks, but he drank every drop. That's how men like him showed gratitude, by not wasting a kindness. Silas sat near the back of the shelter, back against the wall of packed earth, elbows on knees. He hadn't slept, not really, just dozed in and out like a man on watch. His eyes kept drifting to Ellie's face. Every twitch, every breath was a thread that tugged something inside him tighter. Not because she was his, she wasn't, but because something in him had once been small and sick and left behind, and she wasn't, not this time, not on his land. On the third night, Ellie whispered something. Tomas leaned in, then Clara, and then Silas. The girl's voice was dry as cotton, barely more than air through cracked lips, but it came. "Rock candy." Clara blinked, confused. "Sell rock candy," Ellie breathed again. "On Saturdays?" And then she smiled, tiny, weak, but real. And in that one grin, a little crooked from fever, Clara broke. Not in a loud way. She just held her granddaughter tight, rocking back and forth, like maybe if she didn't move, this moment would stay forever. Tomas sat back then. He didn't speak, just nodded once, to the fire, to the spirits, to the dawn that hadn't yet crested the canyon rim. Later, when Ellie slept sound again, Silas stepped outside. Crowley stood there, still holding that ribbon from his niece. "She'll live," Silas said. Crowley didn't turn. "Good," he said. "Then what now?" Silas looked toward the stars. "You go back to Dry Creek." "You mean Cedar Haven?" Crowley said, almost smiling. Silas gave the smallest nod. "Tell 'em the girl's coming home." By midday, they rode slowly. No rush now. Clara cradled Ellie in the wagon, humming that same tune under her breath. Crowley took the lead. Tomas walked behind, then faded into the rocks, like he had never been there at all. Silas rode beside the wagon, not as a savior, not as a landowner, just as a man who'd stayed when it mattered. And somewhere between rock and sky, wind and wheel, something in him let go, not of grief. Grief stays, but of the weight that said he had to carry it alone. Part 12. In stillness, a town remade. 6 months later, the sign still said Dry Creek, but someone had nailed a second one underneath, hand-carved and softer, Cedar Haven. Population 28, depending on the day. Wind still blew here. It carried grit and the slow song of a windmill that Silas fixed himself. It clicked sometimes, one blade was crooked, but no one minded. That sound was how they knew he was still up at sunrise, still turning the old pump to draw clean water out of a deep earth that hadn't yet run dry. The mercantile had life again. A squeaky bell above the door, cloth curtains, shelves stocked with dried beans, molasses, and canned peaches sent from someone's cousin in Tucson. A little girl, still thin but smiling now, sat behind the counter most days stacking rock candy in neat little pyramids, 3 for a nickel. "Don't touch with dirty hands," she'd scold gently, just like her grandmother used to. Clara May kept close but quieter these days. Her shotgun stayed tucked behind the counter, more a habit than a threat. She was no longer waiting for the knock that meant her time was up. Out past the stables, Ruth Ann taught reading. Chalkboards nailed to the barn wall. Kids from nearby hills, ranch hands who couldn't write their names, and even Sheriff Crowley, who sat in the back with a notebook and didn't raise his hand, but listened hard. He'd given up the badge, not because of shame, but because he finally understood what it meant to carry a burden that wasn't yours, and how long it takes to lay it down right. Now he wore a broad hat, boots stitched with someone else's initials, and sat most mornings beside the main road with a tin cup of tea. He wasn't watching for trouble. He was waiting to wave at those who came home. Enoch Sloan came back. He brought the ledger, still worn, still damning, and filed 23 deeds in the county office, this time under witness. People who'd never owned anything now had proof, not paper stolen, not land taken in shadows, but names carved in ink where no one could erase them. Some wept when he handed them the folded copies. Some didn't believe it, not at first. But Cedar Haven had rules now. You stayed, you worked, you helped. Nobody paid rent, but nobody stood idle either. Silas Boone still didn't talk much, didn't smile much either. But most mornings he could be found on that old porch, the one he'd fixed with spare nails and good cedar. He'd sit with his boots crossed, hat low, and 2 tin cups beside him, one for himself and one for someone who once gave up, but chose to stay. No one asked who he meant. Maybe it was Ellie, maybe it was Clara or Crowley, maybe it was someone buried deep in the past, or maybe it was him. Sometimes newcomers passed through, dusty boots, saddlebags thin, eyes full of wind. They'd pause at the town edge, unsure if they were welcome, and someone, Ruth or Sloan or even Ellie, would nod toward the mercantile. "You hungry? Go on in." And that was it. No sermons, no questions, just the same quiet offer that started it all. A bowl of stew on a cold step, a bucket of water left without a word, a man who didn't leave when everyone else did. Cedar Haven wasn't on most maps, but for those who'd been erased, it was the one place where names still mattered, where silence could be safe, where stillness could be home. This town didn't come back because of paper. It came back because someone stood still through wind, through guns, through law, and held the line for what was right. He didn't buy a town. He found a place to stay, and so did they. Not because the world got kinder, but because one man chose to stay still when it was easier to ride on. Because one woman kept a fire going for hands that never knocked. Because a child dared to whisper, "I want to sell rock candy." In the West, redemption never rode in fast. It came quiet, on cracked porches, over shared coffee, through the silence between those who once had nothing left to say. If this story lit something in you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, or just say you were here. And if you believe some trails are still worth walking, go ahead and subscribe, so we don't lose the way back. Thanks for riding with us. The fire's still warm.